How could humanity's first great civilization collapse? Welcome to Collapse, where giants fall. Between the waters of the Tigris and the Euphrates, a legendary civilization rose, defying time and the elements. The Sumerians, masters of the first cities, inventors of writing, builders of an ordered world, laid the foundations of human history. But no empire is eternal. Gradually, their splendor began to crack. From temples once sacred, only ruins eroded by the wind remain. Of kings once all-powerful, only their names engraved in clay bear witness. How could such a visionary people disappear? What secrets buried in the dust of time tell the fall of the first masters of the world? A fascinating story that takes us to the very origins of civilization. But before embarking on a new adventure, remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. Thank you, and have a good trip. At the edge of what we now call Iraq lies one of the most fertile regions of the ancient world, Mesopotamia. The very name of this vast territory literally means the land between the rivers, referring to the Tigris and the Euphrates. These two waterways travel long distances before pouring into the Persian Gulf, depositing on their passage silt rich in nutrients. In antiquity, this abundance of alluvium promoted the flourishing of cereal cultures on an unprecedented scale, allowing human communities to gradually abandon nomadism in favor of a sedentary lifestyle. To understand the beginnings of the Sumerian civilization, it is essential to examine the pre-Sumerian context and the transition from the Neolithic to the emergence of the very first villages. The Neolithic, spanning approximately from 10,000 to 4,000 BC, is marked by the agricultural revolution. It's the period when hunter-gatherer groups began to cultivate land and raise animals. In Lower Mesopotamia, a region located further south, this change is felt when communities, previously mobile, decide to settle near the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates. The irregular flooding of these rivers posed a logistical challenge, but also offered soil flooded with silt, hence extremely productive. Irrigation quickly became the main challenge for these populations. In a rather dry climate, mastering water demanded the construction of canals, rudimentary dams, and storage basins. The first human settlements, which took the form of modest villages, concentrated where even a basic irrigation system could be established. Gradually, the necessity to coordinate the distribution of water led to the emergence of more complex social structures. We begin to see clan or village leaders responsible for equitably distributing water resources and managing cereal surpluses. Meanwhile, the rise of agriculture was accompanied by a gradual domestication of various animal species, sheep and goats first, for meat, milk, and wool, followed later by other farm animals. Around 6500 BC begins the Ubaid period, which extends to around 3800 BC. It is a decisive pre-urban phase. Archaeological sites from this period reveal the existence of pottery made on the wheel, more advanced tools, and architecture made of sun-dried mud bricks. These bricks, made from molded clay then dried in the sun, form the basis of many constructions. Archaeologists have found, in some of these villages, the remains of small sanctuaries, which can be considered as the first architectural manifestations of an organized cult. The inhabitants, aware of the vital role of nature, likely worshipped deities associated with fertility, water, and agricultural prosperity. The transition to the Uruk period, around 4000 to 3100 BC, marks a fundamental shift in the history of Mesopotamia, the formation of true city-states. These political entities, sometimes considered the very first in history, developed mainly in Lower Mesopotamia, in the area that would later be called Sumer, in the south of present-day Iraq. In this southern Mesopotamian region, water resources condition demographic expansion. Cities, to function, need a network of canals fed by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to irrigate their cereal fields, mainly barley and wheat. The better the social organization, the more the harvests increase, and the more the population concentrates in the same place. This results in the formation of autonomous urban entities, known as city-states. The concept of a city-state refers to a city that, while being relatively small in size, exercises political and economic power over the surrounding territories. In other words, each city-state functions as an independent mini-kingdom, with a local government and its own administration. In Sumer, this mode of organization often relies on two essential poles, the temple and the palace. During this period, there is a strong concentration of populations around a few major cities: Uruk, Ur, Kish, Eridu, and Lagash. With the city of Uruk, the size of human groupings becomes such that we speak of a true urban revolution. Architecture reaches new dimensions, as evidenced by the remains of temples built on elevated platforms. These early structures have sometimes been called embryonic ziggurats, since later in Mesopotamian history, the construction of monumental ziggurats would become an unmistakable marker of the presence of a powerful city. Thousands of people organize around these religious and administrative centers. Specialists estimate that Uruk's population at its peak could reach at least 40,000 inhabitants, a considerable number for the time. Uruk's expansion is partly explained by the need to consolidate control over agricultural lands, but also by the rise of long-distance trade. The inhabitants sought raw materials that were unavailable locally, such as construction wood, stone, obsidian, or metals for making tools and weapons. Commercial exchanges therefore intensify. Caravaneers, river navigators, and merchants establish networks that link the Mesopotamian plain to the mountainous regions of the Zagros and Upper Mesopotamia. Although neighbors, these city-states are independent of one another. Due to their proximity, they often maintain commercial relationships, but they can also engage in military conflicts, each seeking to expand its territory or control a decisive irrigation channel for its agriculture. The development of these interregional relationships stimulates technical innovation. The exchanges include not only goods but also ideas. The potter's wheel, which becomes widespread, improves the production of higher quality ceramics and speeds up the shaping of clay containers. In workshops, new decorative patterns are explored and kiln firing techniques are perfected. Moreover, the agricultural surpluses generated by irrigation support a non-farming population: craftsmen, potters, builders, scribes. This division of labor is one of the pillars of emerging social complexity. The emergence of Sumerian city-states is accompanied by a major upheaval, the development of writing. Originally, temple administration used small clay tokens, enclosed in envelopes called boule, to account for livestock, cereals, or jars of oil in circulation. These boule were then marked with symbols indicating the type and quantity of objects. Gradually, it became more practical to directly inscribe these symbols on clay tablets, rather than enclosing them in a sealed envelope. This innovation led to a system of pictograms, namely small stylized images representing an object or concept, a cow's head, a jar, a grain of wheat, etc. But over time, The use of cut reeds to trace signs on clay imposed even more stylization. The pictograms transformed into abstract shapes, made of wedge or nail-shaped marks. This is known as cuneiform writing, from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. The transition from pictogram to cuneiform represents a decisive step, as writing no longer serves only for accounting. It also allows myths, legends, religious hymns, or royal annals, accounts glorifying kings and their exploits, to be written down. Scribes, who master the art of writing, gain a very high social status. Indeed, in Sumerian societies, the ability to read and draft official documents is essential for managing stocks, collecting taxes, and archiving political decisions. The invention of cuneiform writing triggers a cultural revolution. Information can now travel from one city to another in the form of tablets. Administrative and commercial exchanges become more complex. Kings can document their reigns and transmit their laws. Temples, on the other hand, multiply inscriptions to record offerings and perpetuate the cult. In sum, the collective memory of civilization is gradually enriched thanks to this new communication technique. Over the centuries, the classic tribal organization gives way to small chiefdoms, which evolve into embryonic local powers. It is likely that the first chiefs gained their prestige by overseeing water distribution or leading rituals meant to ensure abundance. Then, as sites expand, these chiefs become true administrators, even potential monarchs. This new elite invests in the construction of places of worship, the temples, which become the economic and religious hubs of the community. Within each city-state, there is a well-defined social hierarchy. At the top, there is usually a sovereign called Lugal, literally great man in Sumerian, or Ensi, a title sometimes translated as governor or prince. In some cases, they are also referred to as patisi, a term used to describe a king-priest wielding both political and religious authority. Regardless of the exact name, this figure leads the city in collaboration with the religious elite, who enjoy great prestige thanks to the sacred functions they assume in the temples. Just below the king and the priests, there is a class of scribes, officials, and specialized artisans. Scribes manage accounting, draft laws, and maintain archives. Specialized artisans, goldsmiths, potters, weavers, etc., produce goods of great commercial value and contribute to the city's reputation. The majority of the population, consisting of peasants, shepherds, and agricultural workers, works the fields, raises livestock, or constructs canals. Often dependent on the temple or palace, these workers must in return provide a portion of their production or perform labor duties imposed by public authority, such as digging canals or erecting dikes. Finally, there are also slaves, usually prisoners of war or individuals in debt who have lost their freedom. Slaves have no civic rights and are subject to the will of their master, whether an individual or an institution. By observing the archaeological remains and cuneiform tablets, one can get an idea of everyday life in Sumerian times. Markets and the practice of bartering hold a central place, as metallic currency does not yet exist. Bartering involves directly exchanging one good for another, or using barley and weighed silver, weighed in the form of ingots or small rings, as monetary equivalents. In some cities, there are also clay contracts, tablets that formalize debts, loans, or deliveries of goods. Religious festivities are of paramount importance in Sumerian society. The agricultural cycle dictates the calendar of rites. Before sowing or after harvests, large processions are organized to attract the favor of the gods. These events combine prayers, songs, music, and sometimes animal sacrifices. Purification rituals are also practiced, intended to ward off demons and diseases, or to ensure a favorable flood of the river. In this context of increasing urban organization, the birth of bureaucracy can be observed. Temples and palaces recruit a multitude of scribes to inventory the workforce, tally quantities of grain, manage irrigation projects, and record commercial transactions. This centralized administration is made possible by cuneiform writing, which provides a means to store and communicate information. Beyond these economic and religious aspects, daily life is punctuated by very concrete constraints, such as the construction of mud brick houses, the search for drinking water in a simultaneously fertile and semi-arid environment, and the constant management of risks associated with the floods of the Tigris and Euphrates. The city dwellers protect themselves behind ramparts, aware that the absence of global political unity makes raids and conflicts between rival cities possible. Between 3000 and 2500 BC, the city-states of Sumer in southern Mesopotamia experience a period of remarkable prosperity and stability. This is the Sumerian Golden Age, marked by architectural advances, the development of trade networks, and the structuring of more solid political power. During this period, several cities dominate the Mesopotamian plain, including Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Kish. Each is characterized by a dense urban center, surrounded by irrigated agricultural lands. The soil of the region, enriched by the sediments of the Tigris and Euphrates, offers abundant harvests when well managed. Simultaneously, irrigation works, canals, dikes, and retention basins are perfected. The Sumerians invent sophisticated regulation systems, allowing for the diversion of water during excessive floods and its storage for times of drought. At the heart of these cities, ziggurats are built, gigantic mud brick temples formed of stacked terraces. These religious edifices signal the city's power and symbolize the link between the terrestrial world and that of the gods. The construction works are coordinated by political and religious elites who mobilize local labor to transport thousands of bricks. In some cities, the central ziggurat attracts merchants, pilgrims, and dignitaries from neighboring regions. Economically, Sumer establishes caravan routes linking Mesopotamia to Anatolia, present-day Turkey, the Levant, eastern Mediterranean coast, and Iran. Merchants of this era organized caravans of carts or pack animals, donkeys, primitive equids, transporting wheat, barley, textiles, and manufactured goods. In return, they bring back construction wood, copper, tin, and semi-precious stones, such as lapis lazuli, essential for luxury jewelry and religious ornaments. At the same time, some cities form alliances to defend against nomadic raiders or incursions from mountainous regions. However, despite some attempts at broader unification, no city truly establishes a lasting empire during this period. Sumerian kings, however, begin to conceive of kingship as both a political and divine institution, marking an important evolution from the previous era. Religion is at the heart of Sumerian life. The Sumerian Pantheon is complex and includes several major gods, each associated with natural forces or spheres of human activity. Enlil, the god of air, considered the king of gods and the guarantor of sovereignty. An, the god of the sky, often presented as the father or ancestor of many other deities. Enki, the god of fresh water and wisdom, reputed for his benevolence and ingenuity. Inanna, Ishtar, the goddess of love, sexuality, and war, particularly revered in Uruk. Nanna, the moon god, protector of the city of Ur. Utu, the sun god, regulator of justice and truth. In this religious system, the king serves as an intermediary between the gods and the city. He is entrusted with important rituals, such as ceremonies to obtain favorable flooding or the celebration of seasonal festivals. This religious power complements his political authority, giving the royal function a quasi-sacred dimension. Sovereigns are sometimes depicted on steles and tablets as the protégés of a particular deity, supposed to grant them strength and legitimacy. Sumerian mythology also developed in oral form, later becoming written. One of the most famous stories, whose origins probably date back to this period, is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Although the complete version we know comes from later periods, the first fragments of the story seem to have circulated during the Sumerian Golden Age. Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, embarks on a quest for immortality, traveling the world accompanied by his friend Enkidu. This epic reflects the Sumerian view of life, characterized by close relationships with divinity, reflections on death, and heroic quests. Cuneiform texts, archaeological excavations, and artistic representations provide insights into the daily organization of Sumerian society. The family followed a patriarchal system. Inheritance was primarily passed through the male line. However, women were not completely excluded from spheres of power. Influential priestesses existed, especially in the cult of Inanna, where some women held the status of high priestess, conducting rituals and sometimes administering religious domains. Education was of crucial importance for the elites. Small schools, often attached to temples or palaces, trained scribes. These scribes learned cuneiform writing and mathematics in a sexagesimal system, which is based on the number 60, still perceptible in our 60 minutes per hour and 360 degrees in a circle. Mastering accounting was a key asset for stock management, tax collection, and the coordination of major works. Sumerian art is distinguished by its finesse and attention to detail. For example, many gold jewelry pieces inlaid with lapis lazuli, a deep blue stone imported from Afghanistan, can be found. Artisans also created finely engraved cylinder seals, which were rolled onto clay to mark ownership or sign an official document. Temples are filled with prayer statues, small sculptures, often made of stone or limestone, representing worshippers with wide eyes and clasped hands in prayer. These statues were placed before the deity to mark the perpetual devotion of the faithful, even in their absence. Despite this period of relative stability, rivalries between cities were a recurring feature of Sumerian history. Water was indeed the source of many conflicts. A poorly managed canal or diverted dam could ruin the crops of a neighboring city. Thus, the quest for control of fertile lands and irrigation routes triggered periodic clashes. One of the most famous examples is the conflict between Lagash and Umma, two neighboring cities claiming the same border area. Eannatum, the king of Lagash, emerged victorious and had his triumphant stele of the vultures carved, depicting his soldiers confronting the enemy. However, Sumer was not just about internal battles. The cities established intercultural exchanges with Elam, a region located in what is now southwestern Iran. These relations included both the trade of goods, metals, wood, precious stones, and mutual influence on artistic and spiritual levels. Some Sumerian kings even sought to consolidate alliances or achieve peace by hiring foreign mercenaries or even bringing in specialized craftsmen from other regions to boost their production workshops. Despite tensions, Sumer's reputation grew beyond its borders. Caravanners and merchants told stories of grandiose cities, temples with multiple levels, refined goldsmithing, and abundant grain harvests. Nomadic tribes established in the more arid regions to the north or east looked enviously upon these prosperous lands, prompting the Sumerians to frequently fortify their cities and form militias. Between 2500 and 2330 BC, the Sumerian city-states continued their development, but the Golden Age gradually gave way to more intense political rivalries. Each city attempted to impose its hegemony over Lower Mesopotamia, without succeeding in creating a stable and lasting empire. In this context, three dynasties are particularly noteworthy: those of Ur and Uruk, the Lagash dynasty with the remarkable reforms of Uruk, and then the rise of Kish and other cities further north. At the beginning of the third millennium, two city-states had already gained a solid reputation: Uruk, which prides itself on its religious and mythical history, and Ur, famous for its devotion to the moon god, Nana. The legendary tales of the time speak of great rulers, sometimes on the border between history and mythology. Among them is the most famous of all, Gilgamesh, presented in the Mesopotamian tradition as king of Uruk. Although it is difficult to distinguish the historical part from the legendary part, cuneiform texts describe Gilgamesh as a builder king, responsible for the construction of massive walls around Uruk. These fortifications, some of which were uncovered by later archaeological excavations, attest to the desire to protect the city against potential attackers. The figure of Gilgamesh is also associated with fantastical feats, the quest for immortality, and his friendship with a wild being named Enkidu. These elements, highlighted in the Epic of Gilgamesh in a later form, are rooted in already ancient oral traditions around 2500 BC. Even if Gilgamesh belongs more to myth than factual history, his character illustrates a real phenomenon. Sumerian kings wished to assert their prestige through large architectural projects and the affirmation of a strong personal power. Uruk, thanks to its size and religious antiquity, thus seeks to play a dominant role in the region. For its part, Ur, often called Ur of the Chaldeans in biblical texts, although this denomination is anachronistic for the Sumerian period, also experiences a succession of ambitious kings. The rulers of Ur try to extend their authority by subjugating neighboring cities or by concluding alliances through royal marriages and trade treaties. The cult of Nana, the moon god, acts as a religious cement for the population. The temple dedicated to Nana, also in the form of a ziggurat, becomes an important economic center, collecting tributes in grain, livestock, and precious metals. Successive dynasties of Ur maintain the Sumerian tradition of the Ensi, a term that can be translated as governor or prince. The Ensi represents both the highest political authority of the city and the intermediary with the tutelary divinity. As such, he ensures the organization of sacred rites aimed at maintaining agricultural prosperity and social cohesion. Moreover, Ur, thanks to its geographical position near the Persian Gulf, or at least a more extensive coastline than today, benefits from access to maritime routes that promote distant trade, notably with the Indus Valley and present-day Oman. Within the Sumerian mosaic, Lagash stands out from the mid-3rd millennium thanks to energetic kings. It is known that this city maintains regular conflicts with its neighbor Umma for the control of fertile lands and irrigation canals. In this climate of tensions, social inequalities increase. Archives mention growing corruption among some temple administrators, and the peasant population complains about the increased tax burden. The fiscal pressure weighs especially on the most disadvantaged, who must both contribute to war financing and accept imposed corvées for canal maintenance. Around 2350 BC, a man named Uruk comes to power in the city-state of Lagash. From the beginning of his reign, he distinguishes himself from his predecessors by addressing a plague that is eating away at Sumerian society: corruption. In a world dominated by religious elites and administrators, he dares to introduce unprecedented reforms. The priests, until then all-powerful, can no longer demand exorbitant offerings under the pretext of sacred ceremonies. Religious power is limited, redefining the balance between the temple and the people. The judges, often accused of rendering arbitrary verdicts in exchange for bribes, are placed under surveillance. From now on, the courts must function according to more equitable principles of justice, thus protecting the most vulnerable citizens. But the most striking reform concerns debts. Aware of the crushing weight of loans on the popular classes, Uruk decides to reduce certain debts and free those who had been enslaved for failing to repay them. A revolutionary measure for the time, foreshadowing what history would later call debt forgiveness. These reforms, mentioned in cuneiform inscriptions discovered in Lagash, are considered one of the earliest attempts at social legislation in history. They precede the famous law codes that would later emerge in Mesopotamia, such as the Code of Ur-Nammu around 2100 BC and the Code of Hammurabi around 1750 BC. In his texts, Uruk emphasizes the notion of justice and divine mercy, presenting himself as the protector of widows and orphans. He also describes himself as the restorer of the social balance desired by the gods. To the north of Lower Mesopotamia, the city of Kish attracts attention due to its strategic position. It is located near the boundary between central Mesopotamia and Lower Mesopotamia, thus controlling important caravan routes. The kings of Kish sometimes boast of the title King of Kish as an honorary status, suggesting a form of primacy over other Sumerian cities. While this supremacy remains primarily symbolic, Kish nevertheless profits from its location to forge alliances and host numerous foreign merchants. During this period, Mesopotamia faces pressures from the north and the east. Peoples referred to in Sumerian texts as Subarians or Hurrians begin to make their mark in the mountainous areas. The Hurrians, in particular, gradually settle in Upper Mesopotamia, developing their own cultures and establishing new kingdoms. From time to time, they conduct raids into the richer plains to acquire livestock, grain, or slaves. These incursions compel the Sumerian kings to fortify their cities and recruit troops of professional soldiers or mercenaries. Simultaneously, small groups of nomadic Semitic people, sometimes associated with the Martu, a Sumerian term that would later give Amorites, begin migrating from the west in search of pastures and arable lands. The political fabric of the region thus becomes more complex. The major Sumerian cities must manage both their internal rivalries and the surveillance of their borders. Despite the efforts of some kings to extend their domination, no city manages to establish a truly unified empire. Alliances are formed and undone according to commercial and military interests. A ruler of Kish might temporarily ally with Ur to counter an aggressor from Elam, while Lagash may conclude a non-aggression pact with Umma to focus on the Hurrian threat. Historians sometimes mention a balance system in which each city seeks to prevent another from becoming too powerful. Around 2300 to 30 BC, a new player emerges on the Mesopotamian scene, Sargon, founder of the Akkadian Empire. In a region until then dominated by the Sumerian city-states, the arrival of this conqueror ushers in a new phase of political unification. For the first time in Mesopotamian history, a ruler succeeds in bringing almost the entirety of Sumer under his control, organizing a centralized state and laying the foundations of an imperial administration. Ancient texts, notably the cuneiform inscriptions dating from the Akkadian period or later, recount a legend surrounding the birth of Sargon. It tells of an infant abandoned on the Euphrates in a basket of reeds, a fascinating echo of the biblical story of Moses. According to this story, Sargon was then found and raised by a gardener in the service of the king of Kish. As an adult, he seized power, ending the reigning dynasty and founding his own capital, Akkad. The exact location of this city remains debated by archaeologists, but it is imagined to be somewhere north of the Sumerian region, probably on the mid-course of the Euphrates. From this point, Sargon embarks on a series of military campaigns against the great city-states of Sumer. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Umma, all successively fall under his control. To assert his authority, he does not settle for simple military victories. He imposes the presence of a governor loyal to him in each city. Thus, he establishes an unprecedented centralized administration, overseeing both the collection of taxes and the distribution of resources, such as water and cereals. This form of government breaks with the Sumerian tradition of local power exercised by autonomous kings or rulers. Another key aspect of Akkadian domination lies in language. Sargon and his successors favored Akkadian for administration and diplomacy, even though Sumerian remained the religious and scholarly language. The very ancient Sumerian retained immense cultural prestige, particularly for the writing of myths and rites. Over time, the coexistence of these two languages shaped Mesopotamia. Akkadian, of Semitic origin, gained ground in everyday exchanges, while Sumerian persisted in temples and scribes' schools. The Akkadian Empire also stood out by establishing roads and posts, real marked routes where outposts allowed for the rapid supply of the army or messengers. This innovation facilitated the exercise of power over a vast territory, sometimes distant from decision-making centers. In military terms, Sargon was known for conducting large-scale campaigns, mobilizing numerous and disciplined troops, an unprecedented feat in the history of Mesopotamia. He thus established the principle of the standing army, maintained by agricultural surpluses and tributes imposed on conquered cities. Upon Sargon's death, the throne of Akkad passed to his heirs, including Rimush and Manishtusu, who had to manage an empire still young and facing local resistance. The Sumerians, proud of their independence, often revolted against Akkadian authority, believing that foreign domination contradicted their civic and religious traditions. Sargon's first two successors spent much of their governance suppressing uprisings. Simultaneously, they worked to consolidate the empire's prosperity by developing new diplomatic ties. Akkadian envoys traveled the roads leading to Elam, southwest of modern Iran, Syria, or even Anatolia, establishing commercial agreements to secure supplies of metals and wood. Rimush and Manishtusu thus sought to maintain Akkadian unity by alternating military repression and economic openness. Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, marked the pinnacle of the Akkadian Empire. Aware of the need to strengthen his legitimacy, he proclaimed himself King of the Four Regions of the World. This title aimed to emphasize that he ruled theoretically over the entire known horizon, the East, West, North, and South. In some inscriptions, Naram-Sin went further, practically elevating himself to the status of a living god, an unprecedented gesture in Mesopotamian tradition, where the king was previously considered a privileged servant of the gods, but not a god himself. In military terms, Naram-Sin extended the empire towards Syria, Anatolia, in present-day northern Turkey, and eastwards, probably towards Iran or more eastern regions. The Akkadian power then seemed unshakable, supported by an effective army, a rigorous administration, and dynamic trade flows. Despite these successes, the unity of the Akkadian Empire began to fracture. In the Sumerian cities, attachment to local culture remained very strong. Religious traditions, the use of Sumerian during ceremonies, and civic pride fueled rebellious movements. Appointed Akkadian officials were sometimes ousted, and populations tried to restore their ancient royal lineages. Historians believe that this resistance, although often repressed, weakened the imperial structure by multiplying tension centers. While the successors of Naram-Sin tried to maintain order, a new threat emerged from the Zagros Mountains, located to the northeast of Mesopotamia. This mountain range now forms the border between Iraq and Iran. At the time, various peoples lived there, including the Gutians, mentioned in Akkadian sources as invaders coming from a harsh and isolated environment. Taking advantage of internal troubles and periodic famines plaguing the empire, the Gutians descended into the Mesopotamian plains. The Akkadian Empire, weakened by these difficulties, was no longer able to effectively mobilize its military resources. The Gutians then settled in several strategic regions, pillaging and taking over poorly defended cities. In a few years, the Akkadian Empire collapses due to internal revolts and external attacks led by the Gutians. Akkad loses control of entire regions. Trade routes become disorganized, reducing the influx of raw materials and wealth. The economy undergoes a rapid decline, exacerbated by the destruction of canals and urban centers. Demographically, insecurity pushes many inhabitants to flee, leading to an exodus to safer areas or a return to less centralized lifestyles. The fall of the Akkadian Empire leaves a political vacuum. The Sumerian cities, subjected for nearly a century, regain some form of autonomy. They try to reorganize to rebuild their infrastructures and develop their alliances without the direct interference of an imperial power. However, these cities are very weakened. Successive wars and economic crises have ruined the countryside, destroyed part of the crops, and made canal maintenance more difficult. Sources describe a return to a political fragmentation, meaning a division into multiple local powers, always ready to confront or form ephemeral pacts. In this unstable environment, some Sumerian cities temporarily managed to rebound, initiating what will later be called the Sumerian Renaissance under the third dynasty of Ur. However, the memory of Sargon and Naram-Sin remains vivid, for the Akkadian Empire will remain both a model and a cautionary tale in Mesopotamian memory. Future kings, whether Sumerian, Babylonian, or Assyrian, will draw inspiration from the idea of broad domination and centralized administration, while keeping in mind the fragility of an empire exposed to internal weaknesses and external forces. At the very beginning of the second millennium BC, Mesopotamia emerges from a period of turmoil. The Gutians, a people from the Zagros Mountains, have left the Sumerian plain, leaving behind a fragmented political landscape and weakened cities. However, this power vacuum will quickly be filled thanks to the ambition of some visionary rulers. It is in this context that the figure of Ur-Nammu, founder of the third dynasty of Ur, emerges. Around 2112 BC, Ur-Nammu takes power in the city of Ur, located in Lower Mesopotamia. Immediately, he undertakes a series of administrative reforms. He reorganizes the state apparatus, appoints governors loyal to him, and establishes a centralized operation that quickly proves effective. To consolidate this revival, Ur-Nammu builds the Great Ziggurat of Ur, a monumental multi-tiered temple dedicated primarily to Nana, the moon god. This construction, made of mud bricks, symbolizes the Renaissance and regained power of the city. Moreover, Ur-Nammu distinguishes himself by promulgating one of the oldest known legal texts, the Code of Ur-Nammu. Although it has reached us in a fragmented manner, this code testifies to a desire to codify laws to govern daily life, both for the protection of individuals and for the regulation of the economy. The reign of Ur-Nammu is often depicted as a golden age. Cuneiform inscriptions mention the restart of commerce. Caravans reconnect Ur to Iran, Anatolia, and more distant lands. Cities are beautified, not only through the restoration of temples, but also via civil construction such as paved streets or administrative buildings. The royal tombs of Ur, famous for their sumptuous jewelry, adorned with gold and precious stones, partially date from this period, revealing the city's recovered opulence. Upon the death of Ur-Nammu, his son Shulgi ascends the throne. He inherits a relatively stable situation and seeks to further consolidate the Sumerian state. Shulgi implements a provincial organization. The kingdom is divided into districts led by officials responsible for tax collection, resource distribution, and law enforcement. To reinforce this structure, Shulgi establishes a centralized archive system, where scribes record all movements of goods and the labor duties imposed on the population. To facilitate exchanges, he also creates a network of roads marked by milestones, providing waypoints for the movement of soldiers or caravans. Religion remains a lever of political legitimization. Shulgi, like his predecessors, maintains the cult of Nana and exalts that of Inanna, the great goddess of love and war. However, he takes a further step by proclaiming himself a living god in some inscriptions. This approach, which may seem bold given the Sumerian tradition, aims to further sacralize the royal function, making the king not only an intermediary with the deity, but also a semi-divine entity in his own right. Under Shulgi's reign, the third dynasty of Ur extends its influence over much of Lower Mesopotamia. The routes to Iran and Syria become essential for the trade of metals, wood, and luxury products. Archival texts mention military campaigns and control posts established in peripheral regions. Scribes meticulously record the tributes paid by conquered territories, which helps to further enrich the capital and strengthen royal power. Cuneiform tablets have revealed a surprising facet of Shulgi. He is said to have written hymns in his honor, highlighting his warrior strength, political wisdom, and even his mastery of music. Although the extent of propaganda in these writings remains unknown, they reflect a sovereign concerned about his image and convinced that cultural prestige goes hand in hand with military power. Thanks to centralized administration, urban development projects multiply. Ziggurats are enlarged or renovated, and construction techniques are refined. The raw bricks are better fired, more uniform, and workers are better supervised by foremen from the scribal elite. Irrigation canals, vital elements in this arid climate, are repaired or redesigned to prevent water shortages. Major Sumerian cities adopt more structured layouts, with neighborhoods organized around temples, palaces, and residential areas. The period known as Ur-III also marks the rise of a thriving literature. Scribes transcribe hymns, prayers, and myths onto clay tablets, ensuring the perpetuation of oral traditions. Cuneiform writing reaches a remarkable level of perfection, both in the variety of signs and the care taken in their alignment. Scribe schools develop, allowing a greater number of individuals to master the reading and writing of tablets. The economic system relies on a centralized redistribution of resources. Temples in the palace collect barley, wool, fish caught in the canals, then manage their distribution according to the needs of the population and the army. This system, sometimes referred to as palatial economy, has the advantage of guaranteeing everyone a minimum of subsistence while ensuring close control of wealth by the royal power. Farmers, craftsmen, and scribes employ their skills in exchange for rations and privileges. The large construction projects, temples, palaces, fortifications, require considerable labor, and the state meets this need by mobilizing local populations or hosting workers from neighboring regions. Among the many archaeological sites of this era, the city of Dagan is an example of the importance of bureaucracy. Thousands of tablets recording the distribution of livestock for sacrifices and religious feasts have been discovered there. These documents show a very detailed management of each animal, its origin, age, fate, sacrifice, reproduction, food use. Scribes also note the dates and names of the responsible officials, enabling modern historians to reconstruct the internal functioning of the state apparatus under the Third Dynasty of Ur. After several centuries of prosperity, the Sumerian cities saw their population increase significantly. The vast construction sites, bureaucratic organization, and commercial dynamism attracted many inhabitants. However, this demographic overload exerted increasing pressure on resources, particularly cereal production. In a semi-arid environment, the intensive agriculture practiced in Lower Mesopotamia relied on the constant use of the same irrigated plots. As the climate is hot and dry, the irrigation water tends to evaporate rapidly, leaving salt deposits in the soil. This phenomenon, known as salinization, severely hinders plant growth. Over time, agricultural yields declined. The once fertile fields produced fewer grains, and periodic subsistence crises emerged. Cuneiform records sometimes mention shortages, famines, and even tensions between cities over the appropriation of still exploitable plots. Although the Sumerians attempted to introduce more complex irrigation techniques, such as one-way canals or spill basins, maintaining this network required a large labor force and constant investment. Moreover, hydraulic imbalances between cities could cause conflicts. Simply altering the course of a canal to better irrigate one's own fields could dry out neighboring lands. These disputes, sometimes violent, degraded the essential infrastructure for everyone's survival. In such a climate, preserving stability required not only cooperation, but also a central authority capable of regulating water use. However, this authority was far from uniform. Each city-state acted primarily in its own interest. The accumulation of salt in the soils and the difficulty in maintaining fair irrigation thus contributed in the long term to undermining Sumer's agricultural power. Beyond agricultural problems, Sumer's very prosperity had spawned a vast, centralized, and highly hierarchical administration. Under the Third Dynasty of Ur, for example, numerous scribes managed stocks of grain, livestock, or textiles, while other officials collected levies from farmers. These multiple bureaucratic levels, initially efficient, eventually became a burden on society. The proliferation of officials made the state apparatus costly, while the complexity of administrative procedures sometimes hindered local initiatives. At the same time, the gap between the elites and the population continued to widen. Levies in kind, grain, wool, livestock, as well as labor imposed for canal maintenance and ziggurat construction weighed heavily on the workers' shoulders. Many farmers, indebted, were forced to yield a significant portion of their harvests, or even to serve the temple or palace to repay their creditors. Internal tensions thus arose: local revolts, banditry in the countryside, or formal complaints filed with the administration by exploited peasants. Some cuneiform tablets discovered by archaeologists bear witness to these complaints, where we see plaintiffs accusing a governor or official of imposing arbitrary taxes. The situation worsened especially when the authorities, eager to fund costly wars, demanded ever more sacrifices from rural populations. Even as the Sumerian kings had established some order, royal succession issues regularly emerged, especially after the death of charismatic rulers like Shulgi. The absence of clearly established transmission rules led to violent disputes between potential heirs, resulting in civil wars or coups. Each faction claimed legitimacy of power for itself, creating a climate of mistrust and dissension. Simultaneously, the central power increasingly struggled to control its provinces. Local governors, once appointed by the king, sometimes sought to consolidate their own authority. In a context where communications remained long and dangerous, messages from the royal palace could take several days or even weeks to reach more distant cities. This growing autonomy of governors weakened the state's ability to demand tributes, assemble troops, or maintain a network of fortifications. Faced with the multiplication of military fronts, whether external or internal, the administration lost its effectiveness. The economic dynamism, essential for funding an army and public works, began to wane. Historians see these disunions as a major vulnerability factor. A territory divided among several small leaders was much easier to invade for determined enemies or neighboring peoples seeking new lands. To maintain a large kingdom or empire, substantial resources are necessary. Military campaigns, the construction of fortifications, or the deployment of permanent troops required considerable sums, taken from agriculture and commerce. The state's revenue relied largely on taxes levied on goods and products of the land. However, during a period of incessant conflicts, merchants often preferred to avoid the most dangerous routes, effectively reducing commercial flows and tax revenues. The Sumerian merchants and artisans, who had long thrived on exports of textiles, grains, and manufactured goods, saw their margins diminish. Poorly maintained canals, imposed labor, theft, and exactions by passing soldiers all contributed to a certain weariness among the population, which no longer saw war as anything but a waste of resources and a threat to stability. As the profitability of commerce declined, the financial capacities of the state also waned, creating a vicious cycle where the lack of funds led to military defeats, further exacerbating the economic crisis. In addition to internal weaknesses, Sumer was exposed to external threats from several directions. To the west, in the region corresponding roughly to modern-day Syria, Semitic tribes known as Amorites began settling along the Euphrates. Initially in small groups, they soon established local principalities, taking advantage of the weakening Sumerian powers to settle and take root. Some of their leaders even seized existing cities, where they established their own dynasties. To the east, in the region of Elam, southwest of present-day Iran, another ambitious people coveted the fertile lands of the Mesopotamian plain. The Elamites, who had been in commercial contact with Sumer for centuries, now organized regular raids. Their goal? To control the agricultural riches, raid the temples, and establish their influence. Finally, to the north, various mountain or nomadic peoples, referred to in tablets as Gutians, Hurrians, or Siberians, made sporadic incursions, taking advantage of any opportunity to seize livestock, valuable goods, or force the Sumerian state to pay tribute. Faced with this multifaceted pressure, the third dynasty of Ur attempted to resist, but quickly had to face combined attacks. Around 2004 BC, the city of Ur suffered a major assault coordinated by the Elamites and other enemy groups. The walls fell, temples were pillaged, and many inhabitants were taken as prisoners of war. Tablets from that period describe scenes of devastation, with palaces set on fire, fields abandoned, and a massive exodus. The Sumerian state, already weakened by its internal divisions, could not sustain a conflict on multiple fronts. It lost its legitimacy in the eyes of the governors, who, to survive, preferred to make separate deals with the invaders. Many inhabitants, fearing for their lives, fled to other cities or less exposed regions. Areas once densely populated emptied out, further accelerating the decline of agriculture and craftsmanship. An anecdote related in some Sumerian texts interprets the fall of Ur as divine punishment. According to these accounts, the gods, Enlil, An, Inanna, turned away from the city because of the corruption of the elites and the ingratitude of humans. The Sumerian laments describe this great disaster as a moment of a fateful break between the divine sphere and society. This religious vision reflects the feeling of despair that prevailed at the time, while also emphasizing how closely the Sumerians linked politics, morality, and religion. In addition to invasions and internal tensions, one must consider the climatic changes that may have affected the region at the turn of the second millennium. Several researchers hypothesize an increased drought due to changes in rainfall patterns or the distribution of seasons. The reduced precipitation in mountainous areas would have resulted in less regular flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates, complicating the irrigation of the lands. This climatic disturbance, even moderate, could have caused population displacements from arid or mountainous areas to the still fertile plains, exerting additional pressure on Sumer. In an already tense context, the impact on Sumerian resilience proves decisive. When a society faces both internal issues, Salinization, political conflicts, heavy bureaucracy, and external factors, invasions, climatic instability, its ability to adapt diminishes. The Sumerians, despite centuries of expertise in irrigation, could no longer transform in time to withstand the combination of all these threats. At the beginning of the second millennium BC, as the great Sumerian cities fracture, Amorite leaders gradually take control of several urban centers in Mesopotamia. They establish their own dynasties there, blending local Sumerian traditions with Semitic cultural contributions. Thus, the modest city of Babylon, hitherto not very influential, becomes a major center of power under the Amorite dynasty. Babylonian kings, such as Hammurabi, undertake the unification of Mesopotamia under their rule, continuing the dream of empire once initiated by Sargon of Akkad. Hammurabi's Code, a famous legislative compilation, itself inherits several norms already formulated in the Code of Ur-Nammu. The idea of a written law, placed under divine aegis and applicable to all, finds its roots in Sumerian legal innovations. Babylon, becoming the capital of a vast territory, thus establishes itself as the dominant power of the old Babylonian period, supplanting the Sumerian city-states. Despite these political changes, the Sumerian writing system continues to be used by Babylonian scribes who consider it a scholarly and prestigious language. Administrative, religious, and literary tablets continue the cuneiform tradition, proving the strong imprint left by the Sumerians on Mesopotamian culture. Gradually, Sumerian, once spoken in southern cities, ceases to be a daily spoken language. It is used almost exclusively in the religious and literary sphere, somewhat like Latin in medieval Europe. Sumerian gods are gradually assimilated into Semitic or Amorite deities, such as the great god Marduk, who gains increasing importance in Babylon and eventually supplants some older divinities. Nevertheless, it would be wrong to think that Sumerian culture disappears overnight. The powerful temples, accounting methods, and mythological tales, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, endure. Babylonian, Assyrian, and later Persian scribes long preserved these traditions, copied from generation to generation. Traces of Sumerian thought appear in later legends, in the Hebrew Bible, or in astronomical concepts related to time calculation. After the fall of the third dynasty of Ur, we witness a return to a mosaic of cities and kingdoms: Isin, Larsa, Mari, Babylon, Eshnunna, etc. Each strives to assert itself locally, forming alliances or waging wars against its neighbors. At the same time, trade routes are redirected towards Anatolia, the Mediterranean, and even the distant Indus Valley, favoring an ever wider circulation of goods and ideas. If we trace back in time, it becomes evident that many modern institutions and practices have their roots in the distant past, shaped by a pioneering civilization, the Sumerians. Their cuneiform writing constitutes the first fully realized form of written communication documented. Through it, they recorded contracts, literary tales, and diplomatic exchanges. Thus was born the written administration, laying the foundations of the concept of archives, indispensable for the management of a state. Their influence extends to our way of counting and measuring time. The sexagesimal calculation, based on a base of 60, has endured through the ages. Even today, it shapes our perception of time and space. 60 seconds make up a minute, 60 minutes an hour, 360 degrees define a circle. In Sumer, urban organization relies on meticulous resource management. The grand hydraulic works, essential for land irrigation, are not mere technical feats. They become the cornerstone of city life. The development of the first laws completes this structure, ensuring order within increasingly complex societies. Even the conception of royal power takes shape in these ancient cities. Through Sumerian inscriptions, the figure of the sovereign, endowed with a divine mission, already appears, a guarantor of balance between the gods and men. An idea that will resonate far beyond Mesopotamia, inspiring the sacred Egyptian royalty, Assyrian legitimist ideas, and the foundations of power in Babylon. Sumer was a true laboratory of social, religious, economic, and political innovations. Through the centuries, Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, and later Greeks and Romans will draw inspiration from this heritage, transforming and perfecting the concepts born in the heart of Mesopotamia. A forgotten civilization, yet its imprint remains indelible. A cultural legacy that, despite the dispersion of its cities under the blows of fate, remains one of the pillars upon which universal history was built.